The 50s were known for many things. It was an iconic era of new inventions, art, and societal changes among the average American. Even with the very mention of this decade, you'll probably be able to picture a certain vibe, certain mannerisms of people back then, and how unique and archaic the culture was of that time. However, not many people will associate the 50s with space exploration. Technology might not have progressed that far by then, but it was certainly beginning to, and it made way for some of the earliest man-made satellites to venture out into the great beyond. Today, however, there are more than 2,600 active satellites in orbit, as well as thousands of dead satellites that circle the planet as space junk. The commercial space rush is fueled by plummeting rocket prices and a revolution in small electronics, with companies launching hundreds of additional satellites into orbit every year. The Starlink constellation aims to provide a space-based internet to the world, and SpaceX has plans to launch tens of thousands more satellites. However, the Starlink satellites are expected to last just a couple of years before powering down and burning up in the atmosphere. The lifespan of a few years is nothing compared to Earth's oldest satellite, Vanguard 1. On March 17, 1958, it was launched into space as America's second satellite. Even though it only lasted 6 months after the Soviet Sputnik satellite, Vanguard 1 remains in orbit more than 60 years later. This makes Vanguard Earth's longest orbiting satellite and the oldest man-made object still in space, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. Vanguard stopped communicating with Earth in 1964, but it'll stay in orbit for many years to come, centuries to be precise. Vanguard 1, also known as 1958 Beta 2, was the first satellite to have solar electric power. It was designed to evaluate the launch capabilities of a 3-stage launch vehicle as part of Project Vanguard and the effects of the space environment on a satellite and its systems in Earth orbit. Through orbit analysis, it was also used to obtain geodetic measurements. Part of the key to Vanguard's longevity is that it's truly puny. This spherical satellite weighs only 3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms and measures 6.5 inches or 16.5 centimeters across. It's smaller than a basketball, or as Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev dubbed it, the grapefruit satellite. Although its measurements were small, Vanguard was groundbreaking. It was solar-powered, drawing its energy from 6 matchbox-sized panels. From 1957 to 1958, the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory was tasked with building the spacecraft as part of the science program for the International Geophysical Year. In some ways, Vanguard was also a precursor to NASA. Several Navy researchers who worked on it ended up joining NASA when the space agency was first formed in 1958, creating the core of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. When the project transferred from the Navy to NASA, the researchers went along with it. These scientists set up Project Vanguard as an experiment to see how the environment of space affects satellites. The flight path was meticulously tracked by researchers when it reached orbit. They used that information to refine the understanding of the properties of the Earth's upper atmosphere and observed how its trajectory strayed from their predictions. But Vanguard was also meant to test the launch abilities of a 3-stage launch vehicle, which was also named Vanguard, and that's why it has such a distant, long-term orbit. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were both trying to get military superiority over each other. They had progressed from nuclear weapons to hydrogen bombs to intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, the first of which launched in August 1957. In the 18th-month-long International Geophysical Year, or IGY, which extended from July 1957 through December 1958, both superpowers publicly announced their intent to launch artificial Earth satellites for scientific research. The Soviets first reached Earth orbit with Sputnik 1 on October 1957, and they continued to accelerate by launching a dog, Laika, aboard Sputnik 2 a month later. In those days, successes and failures were close friendships for America. Explorer 2, launched on the 5th of March 1958, suffered a failure of the final stage of its Juno 1 and did not achieve orbit. And as the year went on, more failure was mixed in with more success. Explorer 3 and 4, launched in March and July, were successful, but Explorer 5 in August was lost when the first and second stages of its Juno 1 collided, shortly after separation. For those wondering, NASA's Explorers program is a program that provides flight opportunities for physics, geophysics, heliophysics, and astrophysics investigations from space. Explorer 1 was the first spacecraft of the United States to achieve orbit. Over 90 space missions have been launched since. Moving on, the Vanguard program of satellites, launched by a booster of the same name, suffered an even more dismal fate. Following the 6th of December 1957 just off the pad explosion, no fewer than 5 Vanguard satellites were lost in launch failures between February and September 1958. System failures, stage separation issues, insufficient burn time, and fuel line obstruction were blamed for the root causes. There was an exception to Project Vanguard's line of failures, when the 3-stage Vanguard rocket roared aloft from Launch Complex 18A on Monday, the 17th of March 1958. Between December 1956 and September 1959, this site supported 14 Vanguard launches, followed by 10 flights of the suborbital Blue Scout Junior booster between June 1965 and September 1960. Powered uphill by its single General Electric-built X405 engine, fed by liquid oxygen and kerosene with an initial thrust of 30,000 pounds or 13,600 kilograms, the 75-foot-tall or 23-meter Vanguard was capable of injecting only 20 pounds or 9 kilos of payload into low Earth orbit. Approximately 2.5 minutes into flight, the first stage separated and the second stage took over. The rocket was built by Aerojet. It burned nitric acid and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, producing 7,600 pounds or 3,450 kilograms of thrust in 2 minutes of burn time. The solid-fueled third stage completed the boost to orbit with 2,600 pounds or 1,180 kilograms of propulsive yield. America's second successful artificial satellite was in orbit approximately 8.5 minutes after it left the Cape. And there it would remain. Vanguard 1's initial orbit measured 2,466 miles or 3,969 kilometers in altitude and 406 miles or 654 kilometers in distance from Earth, inclined 34.25 degrees to the equator and circling the globe every 134.2 minutes. Following Sputnik 1 and 2 and Explorer 1, it became the 4th spacecraft to successfully enter orbit. Vanguard 1 was expected to remain in orbit for up to 2,000 years, but solar radiation pressure and atmospheric drag perturbations during periods of high solar activity affected its orbit, and it's currently expected that Vanguard 1 will burn up in the atmosphere after about 240 years, sometime in the late 22nd century. Vanguard 1 is the oldest man-made satellite currently still in orbit. Sputnik 1 and 2 died off in January and April 1958, respectively, and Explorer 1 lasted until March 1970. It's not to say that it's still functional. For more than 5 decades, Vanguard 1 has been a derelict spacecraft. As mentioned earlier, this satellite was the first satellite to use solar cells, all 6 of which were mounted on its body. Its 6 antennas gave engineers and trackers information, as well as information about electron current and internal temperature. A tiny transmitter powered by the satellite's mercury battery provided tracking data that demonstrated the shape of Earth was slightly pear-shaped, or more precise, had a slight north-south asymmetry, with its stem close to the North Pole. Vanguard 1 received its final radio signals in May 1964. Today, both satellite and its attached upper stage remain in space, silently circling the globe every 134 minutes. Having been in business for 60 years, which is equivalent to 21,900 days or 525,000 hours or 31.5 million minutes or even 1.89 billion seconds, Vanguard 1 is an unchallenged record holder. It has completed more than 235,000 orbits since it was launched, and if its end of the 22nd century demise date is true, it may have completed about 940,000 orbits by the time it finally dies out. Even though Vanguard 1 may not carry great recognition in the memories of the public anymore, it remains a sterling example of humanity's thirst for knowledge and desire to continually explore the cosmos. More than a century from now, when Starlink has been forgotten, future space travelers may be able to take a trip to Vanguard, getting an up-and-close look at humanity's oldest space-based archaeological site.